So I think there are a couple things to understand. So the first is that if you're a man who's struggling in the world today, we as men assume that if we're struggling, we need to fix something on the outside, right? So if I am not making enough money, the answer to that is to get some additional certification or become more productive, maybe use some kind of supplement. So that men are fundamentally different because we are conditioned, and this could be somewhat biological, but it's certainly societal, to solve our problems externally. But the one overwhelming thing that I've learned about men is that, if you're a man who wants to get better, 90% of what you need to do is not outside of you, it's actually inside of you. But this is not where men look, right? We think like, okay, I need to get this kind of car, I need to get sexier, I need to be able to bench twice as much. So we always look to things outside of ourselves. But in the majority of the work that I've done with men, really the work that they need to do is internal, but we're not taught how to do that. There's a really great example of this. So if you look at the top 1% of earners versus the top 10%. So the top 10% of earners on the planet have a higher IQ than the top 1%. The people who actually make the most money have a lower IQ than the quartile right underneath them. And the big difference there is that people in the top 1% have a very high EQ. So we grossly underestimate the capacity to control oneself. And if you really want to achieve the most in life, that's what you really need to focus on. And the more that I work with men, this is basically what I teach them, and the outcomes that I see are amazing, right? We're talking like on the worst end. I worked with a 32-year-old guy who started using drugs when he was 13 years old, polysubstance use, mostly opiates and heroin. So at the age of 32, no job, not living on the street, crashing with his girlfriend. And then within a span of 4 years, this guy became a therapist himself, had a stable income, got married, and published his first dystopian fiction novel. So we're talking about a 4-year span of like being literally a heroin addict to, being a published author and like having a stable, fulfilling relationship and job. And all of that work is like internal. It's about understanding the way that you work, understanding the way that your brain works, and learning how to control yourself. So I've worked with plenty of women for whom that is a problem as well. But I think if we look at on average, right? So remember that like within any population of men and women, there's going to be more variance between women than there is between men and women.
Sure.
So absolutely the case for a lot of women. I think the big difference is that a lot of the tools that we have were sort of designed with women in mind. A great example of this is like psychotherapy or talk therapy. So if you look at the gold standard of how we process our emotions, it's verbally. Now, the studies actually show that if you look at like estrogen has a very, very interesting effect on awareness of your internal emotional state and the ability to articulate your internal emotional state. So as estrogen rises, you literally feel emotions more. So this is why women will have problems like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMS. When there are these hormonal fluctuations, it's not that we should treat them poorly or anything like that, but they actually literally feel emotions in a more intense way because of the fluctuations in their estrogen level. So the higher your estrogen is, the more emotional awareness you'll have. So there are some biological factors, and then there's also like, if you look at the way that women are conditioned, they're conditioned to be good listeners, to provide emotional support for the men around them. And so they're a lot better at verbal fluency. Like that's not even related to emotions. You can look at, boys and girls who are 8 years old. Girls will have a higher level of verbal fluency than boys do at the age of 8. So there are a lot of things in our mental health system that rely on being aware of your emotions, being able to articulate your emotions, using words to process your emotions. And so absolutely they can learn more about themselves. I think 99% of human beings on the planet, myself included, can benefit from learning more about themselves. But I think that women have somewhat of a leg up, which is why women are 70% of patients who seek psychotherapy, right? Even 70% of therapists are women. So there's like a very clear gender gap in the field of mental health. So I think the best place to start, I know it's gonna sound kind of simple, but is to look at yourself. So what a lot of us do is anytime we have a problem, the first thing that we do is we try to jump to a solution. So if I'm unhappy in life, I need to make more money. If I'm struggling with dating, I need to get a better job or be sexier or whatever. So we tend to jump to solutions. So I think the first thing that you've got to do is slow a little bit down and look at yourself. And when you look at yourself, there are a couple of things that I think a lot of people really miss. The first is what drives a lot of their behaviors. So we focus so much on fixing a behavior, like using heroin, for example, right? But we don't really ask ourselves, why am I using heroin in the first place? Where does the drive for using heroin come from? And that is the key question, right? So it's not about how you need to change. It's about, why am I the way that I am? And this is where people make such a simple mistake. I'd say the majority of people that I talk to, when they look at themselves, they're not critically thinking. What they actually do is they'll make some kind of conclusion. I'm lazy. So think about what that means. Laziness, first of all, is not a thing. There is not a laziness circuit in the brain. You can't measure laziness. Laziness is a lazy way of looking at laziness. If we look at human behavior, motivation, discipline, things like follow-through, willpower, these are all discrete functions within our brain, and then we just say, oh, we're lazy. But which one of those things is lacking? So as we understand, okay, why are we lazy? What does that really mean? Where is my motivation coming from? What is the status of my willpower? As we explore these kinds of things, that's when we see really what the answer is. And the really cool thing is, if you look at a lot of research on things like, we use this technique called motivational interviewing, where in order to change behavior, you don't need to convince anyone of anything. You need to help people understand things. And once a human being understands something themselves, they will automatically change behavior, right? If I tell you, hey, Steven, don't touch that pan, it's hot, and you touch the pan and you burn yourself, you won't listen to me. But the moment that you touch it and you get burned, suddenly your behavior will change on its own. We learn through experience. But if you look at the way that most people try to solve their problems, it's not through experience, it's through information. Oh, I have a problem, let me buy a book. I have a problem, let me listen to a podcast. Let me watch a YouTube video. And this is what we see, right? There are literally millions, if not tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people out there who are gaining a lot of information about change, but aren't actually changing. It's wild. There's a lot of subtlety, but the craziest thing is that, anytime we engage in some kind of self-help kind of thing, it actually is a coping mechanism to deal with some negativity within us. So let's say that I feel like I'm lazy. So then my mind looks at me and says, okay, I'm lazy, I need to do something about it. And then it's really tricky, right? Because your brain sees two options. One is that I can do something hard, or the other is I can do something easy. And we have to understand this. The brain has evolved to be lazy. The brain has evolved. Laziness is efficiency. We want to get the most yield out of the smallest investment. So then what happens is our brain is like, okay, I could go to the gym, or I could watch a video about working out. And if I watch a video about working out, I will be more efficient when I go to the gym. There are all kinds of scams that we run in our mind to actually activate parts of our brain that make us feel like we're making progress without actually making progress. That's how you become a self-development junkie or self-help junkie. Talking about our problems can absolutely make things worse. So let's understand a couple of things. So the first is that there's this assumption that talking about your problems makes them better, but there are actually very specific things that need to happen in order for talking about your problems to make things better. The most important thing is something called an emotional catharsis. So this is where you have a breakthrough in therapy. So there's this moment where there's a lot of dormant stuff, and Freud even described this, where you have this moment of very, very intense emotion that is relatively new. It's kind of dormant, but it's not like venting. We'll get to venting in a second. And so there's a particular way we have to talk about problems that triggers emotional catharsis. Emotional catharsis creates something like a breakthrough. So this is also an experience. So this is not just talking about my problems. This is experiencing my problems in a different way. So it's kind of like touching the hot pan. Mm-hmm. Usually it's kind of painful. So when we're doing work with a trauma survivor, we don't want to just talk about the trauma. We want to sort of dig into it a little bit more and have an emotionally healing experience. The real problem is that sometimes what'll happen is people will just talk about their problems. So they'll use therapy as essentially like a venting session. And venting, if we look at kind of the neuroscience of venting, venting is useful for reducing our negative emotion in the moment. So this is a big thing that people don't understand. The primary motivator for change is actually negative energy, a negative emotion. So this is the problem with venting. If you vent and get rid of all of your negative emotional energy, the drive to change will disappear. So if we kind of think about it, what motivates you the most? It's actually negative emotion. And you can literally look at the neuroanatomy of things like the amygdala. So the amygdala is very close to the hippocampus, which is where learning and memory happen. So we actually learn the most through negative emotions. So if I've been happily married for 15 years and there's infidelity, right? One case of infidelity, the negative emotion from that one case of infidelity can drastically motivate me. So one of the biggest problems that I see is that we try to get rid of our negative emotions, and in doing so, we actually hamstring our motivational capability. So I've seen this a lot where people will come in and they'll go through like what they think therapy is, which is like, actually same guy, Mike, came in and he'd like kind of talk about his problems. And I was like, bro, Mike, is this helping? So I was still a trainee at the time. So he'd been seeing me for about 6-8 months. And I was like, you come in here and you kind of talk about your problems, but like you don't seem to be getting better. I didn't know how to do therapy at the time. And then he's like, isn't that what I'm supposed to do, is come in and talk about my problems? I was like, yeah, I think so. I was a second-year psychiatry resident, but I was like, is this helping? He's like, no. And I was like, okay, we got to do something else then. Coming in and just venting is not actually psychotherapy. That's not like, so talking about your problems, reducing your negative emotional energy can actually keep you stuck. And if you pay attention to people in your life, you'll notice that there are some people who just like bitch all the time, right? They're just like constantly complaining, they're constantly venting, and they don't actually do anything to change their life.